All right, good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. Today we are discussing Anatidae, which is a family of the birds. With this, I just want to give you guys the basics that you need in order to identify the birds of this specific family. So in our taxonomy discussion, it was mentioned that organisms, as a part of taxonomy, get grouped together. Similar groups are, placed together. For practical purposes, we're talking about the family level of grouping today. We can look at a broad category with this without losing the easily defined characteristics that a broader look at the organisms are going to give us, and without kind of getting lost in the weeds and the details that looking at a genus or a species level, which is the level of categorization that's lower down beneath family, would give us. If we were going farther up, looking at the class Aves, that's just what defines a bird. So it's going to have feathers, it's going to have a four-chambered heart, it's going to lay hard-shelled eggs, but that just tells you it's a bird, and for ID purposes, you can tell it's a bird. That doesn't really get you much. Order's a little bit more manageable, but if we're looking at that level, we're going to be finding a lot of organisms that we, as people living in North America, aren't going to encounter, right? And with, genus and species, you're going to be there forever, just lost in the tiny minutia. So family is a really good level to start your study with. It's going to be what gives you the opportunity to narrow down what part of your field guide you're looking at. Field guides are organized taxonomically, so the family groups are going to be stuck together. And that does make it a lot easier to find what birds you're looking at if you learn how to recognize the shared characteristics of specific families. Today, with Anatidae, we're basically looking at what makes a duck a duck. Anatidae are our ducks, there are geese, our swans, they're the waterfowl. Some examples of this, because of course we have to have examples so we know exactly what we're talking about. The tundra swan is a really great one. These are our examples of our swans. Emperor geese, things like our king eiders, our wood ducks. And if we look at all of those together, they're wildly different. Nobody's going to take a look at a wood duck and then go back to the tundra swan and be like, yeah, those are the same, because they're not. They're in different genuses, obviously. They're very, very different birds, but they do have shared characteristics that allow us to place them in the same family. And it's also important to note with this one, Anatidae is a big family. There are some species, or rather families, of birds that are only found in certain parts of the world, even certain portions of the continents. But Anatidae is found worldwide. They are cosmopolitan, they are everywhere. And because of that wide range of this family, there's a lot of diversity to be found. And that's because this widespread range means there's a ton of different habitats that they're living in. And different habitats means different stresses and different sorts of challenges that they need in order to survive, so the birds are going to have different traits. So, starting off with some shared characteristics, the babies. And I did intentionally pick a picture of a baby Canada goose surrounded by flowers. We've all got our own, or many of us do at least, our own horror stories of the time you accidentally made a Canada goose angry when you were a kid at a park and you got too close. The babies are adorable, though. And waterfowl babies are cute. They're what we call precocial young. which means when they hatch, they are covered in that fluffy down, which keeps them warm, keeps them insulated, because remember, they're babies, they have a hard time regulating the temperatures, they're just not large enough, they don't have the fat reserves necessary to do it, so they've got these great fluffy feathers, but they're incredibly active as far as babies go. With things like songbirds, you're going to see a baby that comes out of the egg, and it's blind, and it has no feathers, and it's an ugly little pinky thing that the parents have to take care of for weeks at a time before they're able to leave the nest. For most of our waterfowl, the babies are able to leave the nest within a day or so of hatching. And for some of our waterfowl, like our Canada geese, that means they just toddle off of the nest that they're on, that's on the ground. And then they go into the water and they swim after mom and dad, and they're feeding themselves and they're doing all of this. For some of our waterfowl, that requires a little bit more extreme behavior. This is a baby wood duck. They are cavity nesting birds, which is weird to think about, ducks nesting in trees. But that means that the babies have to jump out of the trees when they leave the nest, and which is absolutely terrifying to watch. There's several very well-established wood duck conservation projects. Because they're cavity nesters, they've lost a ton of nesting habitat, but they do take to nest boxes really well, and that allows us to research a ton of information on their behaviors. But part of that is watching those babies leave the nest, and it's very difficult to just stand there and watch them drop 12 feet down to the ground. They bounce. There's lots of videos you can find online of it. It's absolutely heart in your throat to watch, because they are fluffy and adorable and tiny, and they just leap out of trees and boxes. It's ridiculous. Another shared characteristic is going to be their shape. So we've got a wide variety of shapes that we see with our waterfowl. Nobody's gonna try and fool themselves and say that a goose is the same thing as a duck, but we do see a similar body structure. It's an elliptical. Of course, size has to do with it. We've got very small ducks that adults could feasibly hold in one hand with a little bit of straining, and then we've got things like swans where you need both arms and some backup if you want to hold them safely. But essentially, they're footballs with wings and a neck of variable size and length. And when you see them flying, you can see that. They have to work really hard to keep in flight. They're generally pretty heavy birds. It's one of the reasons that they're hunted as much as they are. There's a lot of meat on there. So the wings are working really, really hard. They've got very strong flight muscles. That makes them heavy. And it gives them a very distinctive football shape, regardless of how long the neck is, how long the wings are. Another shared characteristic we're going to find with the Anatidae family are going to be their feet. They're called waterfowl for a reason. We find them in the water, and part of that means they need to swim. And what better way to do that than having what is essentially flippers attached to your legs? Our Anatidae family has webbed feet, so they've got skin in between their toes, which allows them to swim efficiently. Now, if you've ever seen a duck on land, they're clumsy, their legs are a little bit too short for it, they waddle. And that is a shared characteristic of our waterfowl. For the most part, their general rule of thumb is they're not great on land. They don't have to be. They're going to be swimming, they're going to be flying, they can walk to whatever extent they need to, but flight and swimming are going to be their two primary modes of transportation. Walking doesn't get them anywhere fast. With regards to the beaks, we see a good amount of variety here. We've got 3 species here. From top to bottom, we've got the ever-present Canada goose, which we are all familiar with. The one in the middle is our common merganser, which is a fishing duck. And if you look closely at that beak, it's got a hook on it. If you were able to look very closely to it, you would actually see that the edge of the beak has a serrated edge because fish are slippery. And if you don't have sharp teeth to hold on to them, then your beak better have something sharp and preferably jagged to really dig into those slippery scales so your meal doesn't go away. And then, of course, we've got our spectacled eider, which is that silly-looking fellow down at the bottom, and they're eating things like shellfish, in addition to living way, way up north. So it's very cold, and that explains, at least to some degree, why there are feathers pretty much all the way down to where its nostrils are. Beaks get cold, so the more coverage you can have, the better. Now, the reason we see such a wide variety of shapes within these beaks is because they're eating different things. The eiders are going after hard-shelled organisms. They need a lot of leverage to be able to crack those open. Mergansers are going after fish. They need to move quickly. They need to hold on once they've nabbed something. And then Canada geese are going to be eating plants. The occasional insect, yes, but plants don't move fast, they just need to be ground up. So it's a different shaped beak, but you'll notice they're not really hooked. They're mostly flat. For the majority of ducks, if you get bitten by them, that's not going to hurt. Geese can put enough power behind it that nobody wants to be bitten by them. As I mentioned, goose horror stories from childhood and ill-advised adventures, but as a general rule of thumb, you're going to have that rounded tip, elongated beak that's flattened, but you can tell a lot about really any bird based on the shape of their beak, and with our waterfowl, it's going to tell you a ton about which genus you're dealing with once you get past, oh, this is waterfowl, so it's going to be a swan, a duck, a goose. If you're outside of North America, you're looking at shell ducks, shell geese, and all manner of other exciting things. The world of waterfowl is wide and varied and actually pretty well studied because there's so much human interaction. Now, I mentioned these guys are found in the water, waterproof feathers. Goose down is, to this day, still one of the best insulators you can find. Even with all of our technological advancements, nature got it down right with them, and so we still make use of that down. And then the habitat itself. I mentioned it's a wide variety because it's all across the globe, but it's going to have water in it. You're not likely to find a duck or a goose or a swan in the middle of the desert. You may, if there's water nearby. Many of them are migratory species, so stopover points and getting lost happens. But your best shot for finding any of this family, stick close to the water. So now that we've got our characteristics for Anatidae, the compact bodies, strong wings, the beaks, the feet, the feathers, once you figure out that silhouette that we mentioned in our ID talk, when we're looking at all of these shared characteristics, those will help you narrow down the very details. The shared characteristics are great. Those are what you can take at a glance and know, okay, this is the family I'm dealing with. I've got this many pages in my field guide now that I need to look through. But many of those shared characteristics can also, if you pay attention to the slight variations, tell you more about it. The beaks are a shared characteristic. It's going to be flattened. But if you look at it and it looks really skinny and it's got a tiny little hook at the end, in North America you've got like 3 potential species that it could be. And they're all going to be mergansers, the fishing ducks. If you're looking at a bird and it looks like any type of waterfowl, but it is entirely white, I mean, you've got 3 species of geese, not geese, I'm sorry, you've got 3 species of swans, and then like 2 species of geese that are entirely white. Out of 5 species, you can narrow that down pretty easily to at least 1 or 2 options. So we take those shared characteristics and we can apply them to whatever bird we're seeing. And the goal of this is, if you're familiar with your families of birds, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can at least get a little bit farther in your identification more quickly and with more confidence. Traveling and birding go hand in hand. Many of us as birders have locations that we want to go specifically for birding purposes, to see birds we've never seen before. And you can study the birds in those areas, and I encourage you to do so. But you're going to get farther knowing the families of birds that you're going to be seeing, more so than just studying the individual species. If you learn the families, those shared characteristics, you're looking at, a handful of families with those characteristics that you need to look for, and then you can narrow them down in your field guide once you see those birds. But if you're looking at a list of 60 or 70 species, that's going to take you a lot longer. It gives you way more room for error, and you're going to be far less confident about what it is you're seeing because everything's new. Now, our bird of the week today is one literally everyone has seen. And I say that with confidence because I work with children and they can ID it too. And it's our mallard. Now, this is the most common duck we've got here in North America. They are everywhere. They are in the wild. They are in our zoos, in our parks, in our backyards. You cannot look for ducks without tripping over a mallard. They are, as many of our ducks are, incredibly dimorphic. And by that I mean we've got 2 different ducks that we're looking at here, but they're the same species. One is male, one is female. Our green-headed lad is the male duck. He's bright and colorful, whereas that female is quite a bit more cryptic. She's going to be the one sitting on the nest, keeping close to the babies once they hatch, whereas he is essentially wearing a bright, shiny sign around his neck that says, "Hi, there's a duck over here." Now that's great for him. He can fly, he can swim, he can take care of himself. Our baby birds, things like our tiny little duckling, super brave, jumping out of trees, our little goose, baby, they cannot fly. They can swim, but it's slow because they're tiny. But the adults can take care of themselves pretty well. So we see here a distinct division of how these parents are going to be involved in the raising of the young. Now, this doesn't hold true for all waterfowl. You're going to be hard-pressed to tell a male goose or a male swan from the females. There'll be some behavioral tics that you can pick out, but just by looking at them, just hanging out, it's unlikely that you'll be able to tell. With ducks, it's quite a bit easier. With our mallard ducks, I do want to draw your guys' attention not so much to that bright coloration that the male is sporting, because that's very easy to see, but to his wing, where you can see that small patch of dark blue bordered by white on both sides. Now, this is a group of feathers that we call the speculum on ducks. It's a patch of colored feathers on their secondary wing feathers. But for ducks, if you want an ID and you can only pick one body part to get it off of, always choose the wings. The males and the females are going to have some variation, but that speculum with our dabbling ducks is going to be the key to identifying it. With just the wing of a duck, you can identify which species it is, whether it's male or female, and you can even, to a certain extent, age that duck, see how old it is. If it is a first-year bird, it's hatched, it's just in its first molt, or if it's, been alive for a couple of years. Now, these are what we call dabbling ducks, which means their feeding behavior, their foraging, is going to involve feeding under the water by tipping forward to graze on underwater plants. As I mentioned, they're going to be found pretty much everywhere, but the reason it's important to learn the mallard, what it looks like, what the males look like, what the females look like, what the males look like when they're in something called eclipse plumage, when the only real difference that's visible that you can see is that the beak is going to be a different color than the female's is, but they're going to otherwise be covered in what looks like female plumage, that speckled brown that doesn't show up very well, allows them to hide. The reason you want to know the mallard is because it's our most common bird with regards to our waterfowl. Once you know what a mallard looks like, when you're looking at ducks, you'll know if you're looking at a mallard or if you're looking at something totally different. When you're starting out, or if you're just casually walking through a park, it's really easy to dismiss ducks as they're just ducks, and you don't think that there's a lot of variety with them, but there's a ton of biodiversity in terms of ducks. In the Bay Area, we are in the middle of the Pacific Flyway. Every winter, we get hundreds of thousands of waterfowl visiting us. And that means you're not just looking at mallards. You're looking at tens of different species that are only going to be here for a couple months, but sometimes they look a little bit similar to our mallards. There's a couple of species of ducks that look ridiculously similar to female mallards. In the East Coast, the American black duck is the biggest perpetrator of this. They look very, very aggravatingly similar to female mallards, both the males and the female black ducks. But if you're paying attention to those details, what the exact color of the beak is, the shade of the body feathers, you'll be able to catch when that mallard doesn't quite look right. And that will serve you very, very well in your birding. In fact, half of the battle is being able to say what a bird isn't. Once you can get those, you'll find that the IDs come a lot more easily. So, have an excellent weekend. Study up on your ducks. We've got some time before the migration hits us, but you want to be ready for the winter time when you can go out to the Central Valley or to the San Francisco Bay and see hundreds of thousands of geese and ducks just take to the air as dawn hits the wetlands. If you haven't ever done that, I sincerely encourage you to do so, because it's mind-boggling, the numbers coming off of the wetlands and the marshes. Have a great weekend, and I will see you all next week.